unitary. I'm going to go to the next slide in just a second, and that's going to also explain to you guys unitary government as well. So you see here that a unitary government, here's a definition right here, power centralized, and also states derive their power from the central government. What that means, I apologize for this pop-up. What that means is that the central government, meaning the national government, is the most powerful. I actually prefer, when I explain it, to create a document like, or to create a diagram like this, which is really, really simple. And if you see here, in the squares are national government for these diagrams. And you see here, obviously, the square is much bigger than the smaller circles, which I'm going to call states. And I'm going to put S's in the states. This is what we call unitary, because all the power is going from the central government, the national government, down. And that's the direction that power moves. And that is what I'm going to call a unitary government. U for unitary is what that means. So now if we backtrack to the previous slide, you can see the same direction of power moving from central government down to the states, down to the people. So mostly all of the government power exists on that national level. That's what the colonists knew under Great Britain. That's not what they wanted. They wanted the opposite. So now all the power is here, and they don't want that. Instead, they're going to do something where they create all the power here on the state level, which is why they created the kind of government that we call a confederation, which is the exact opposite of a unitary. So we're looking here at what the colonists actually created, which is a confederation. And that's where you're seeing all the power coming from the states. So I'm going to go back to the original diagram, and you see here that your national government became much smaller, and your states got much bigger, because all the power here now goes from the states to the national government. So the direction is the exact opposite. And this is a confederation government, so I'll put a C with a circle around it so we know that that's a confederation government. Which, go back to this diagram now, and you can see, again, the same idea, the power moving from the states to the central government, and the central government really not having any power except the power that the states allows it to have. So you're really what we call a league of friendly states. Now, the states are friends, they're bound together very, very loosely by this very weak central government. In a government like a unitary government here, which we can't really see because I've got all the marks on, I'm going to go back and erase that really quickly. In this government, you guys can see that there's a whole lot more power. Hopefully you understand there's a lot more power on that national level. Maybe this diagram helps you that there's a very centralized unit here, because the unit is all the national government, whereas here power is very decentralized, meaning smaller units, the smaller states, have more power. So even though the size is bigger here, they're all their own independent state, very loosely bound together by a national government. It's the exact opposite of the unitary. Power in states and confederation, power in the national government in a unitary government. So now, knowing that that's what we had, and you already know that this government didn't work, the question you now need to ask yourself is why? Why didn't the Articles of Confederation work? Before we can even do that, let's look at the actual, word definition of what it was. So we call this Confederation government the Articles of Confederation. In 1776 was when it was first created. Even though in 1777 the Articles had still not been approved yet, they were kind of a work in progress. By the end of the war, the Articles went into action. So this is what you're seeing here. So 17, just so we understand dates, and guys, dates are not a crucial part of understanding this, but just know this is kind of how long it took for this government to really come into place. The reason why it took so long is because the Articles of Confederation required every single state to ratify. The word ratify means to approve. In case we don't know what ratify means, right there, ratify, guys, means to approve. I'll just leave that up there so you can see it. But the idea is that the Articles of Confederation were just adopted immediately after the war was over, and really went into place immediately after the war. And so the colonists was kind of It was a very new experiment. It was a new thing. And what they knew they wanted was the exact opposite of what they experienced before. They were very allegiant to their states. At this point, after the Revolutionary War, people didn't call themselves Americans. They called themselves Georgians or North Carolinians. They did not call themselves Americans. So they really had their allegiance with their state, and they did not trust the national government, which makes sense for them for why they would create this thing called a confederation. So it makes sense that it was called the Articles of Confederation. So what did it do? How was it what was it made of? That's the next thing you want to ask yourself, is what was the Articles of Confederation? So it was very, very simple. It was a very simple form of government. Let's see if I can write simple so we can remember that word on the slide, that the Articles of Confederation was simple. Let's see if we can fit this here. So it was a one-chamber Congress, meaning it was a one branch of government with Congress that made laws, and Congress was one chamber. There was no House and Senate separate. It was one chamber, one Congress. That was the entire government. Each state sent one person, no matter what your size, and that was a national government. They didn't need a big national government because it couldn't do much. So what could it do? Here's what it could do at the very bottom here. Create a money system. Create post offices. Request troops, and notice that key word here, request. They didn't have a standing army. They had to ask the states to send militia from their states if the new government was to go to war. They were supposed to be able to settle disputes between states, but they really had very little power to do so. They could make war and make peace. They could enter into war, but to do so, they had to request again, come back over here, the troops from the states, so that made war a lot harder. They could send ambassadors, which is a representative to a foreign nation. They could write treaties, and the only thing they could do to make money was to borrow money. They could not raise revenue themselves. To raise revenue means to raise a tax. They did not have the power of taxation. So what you'll see on your note sheet actually is a list of these items here, but you're going to ask, but the questions asked of you is not what the powers are of Congress, but why. Why are these a bad combination of powers? What makes this government so weak? Because if you know this government failed, like the title of the presentation told you, the question you should ask yourself is, why did it fail? What made this government not work? And part of the problem is the powers that were given to it weren't enough. So what was the problem with the borrowing of money? What was the problem with requesting for troops? What was the problem with having unanimous consent to get anything done, which is something else on your sheet of paper that you see here. Unanimous means every state had to agree to change the documents. If they wanted to even add taxation, they had to have every state participate. So now going on to the next slide. So now you see here, and this is something I've already said, is that the Articles of Confederation failed. It didn't work. It was a good try. It was a good idea because we were the exact opposite of what we've experienced before. And if you want to ask yourself now, what is a confederation? I'm going to give you guys a minute to think about that. You can say it's a loose union of states. But why is it a loose union of states? Really what you want to ask yourself is, where's the governing power in a confederation? And you should be thinking to yourself right now that the governing power in a confederation lies with the state governments. So what were its major problems? It was decentralized. It was decentralized because there was no power in the national government. Remember, the more centralized form of government we've discussed so far is that unitary government. Incredibly centralized because everything's happening on that top level government. Everything in the Articles of Confederation was happening on the bottom level state governments. So there was no real connection of the states. They were friendly, but they really didn't do much else together. They actually competed against one another because they were each regulating their own trade policies. They were each taxing individually. And that was because the national government could not. The national government could not tax. The national government could not regulate trade. So each state was in competition with the other states to trade with other states and to trade internationally. The other thing Congress couldn't do was enforce laws. They could write laws, but they couldn't force anyone to follow them. And then if they wanted to add a new law, they needed what's called a supermajority to do so. They needed a law to be approved by 9 of 13 states in order for it to be passed. Today, for laws to be passed, it only requires a simple majority, which is 51%. 51% of 13 guys would only be 6.5 states, or even 7 states even. So you need a whole lot more states to agree to the laws for them to be passed in the Articles of Confederation. The other issue is that even when they would meet to pass laws, most states wouldn't show up. So you often wouldn't get this lucky number 9. You normally couldn't get that to even show up at the actual meeting to write laws. So this government was really set up to fail. The other issue is that, let's say they noticed that the previous powers were an issue, and then to amend or change the Constitution, they'd have consent of all the states. Well, when they don't all show up to your meetings, that's pretty hard to do. There's no executive branch to enforce policies. There's no court system, so the settling disputes is supposed to happen all by Congress. Pretty much, they weren't enough people to get done everything they need to get done. They were pretty much inadequate. So people stopped supporting the government and really just focused on their states. The government was in huge debt from the war, and so it needed to raise money. The national government did, but it had no good way to do so. So what happens here, and we're going to watch a quick video about it in just a moment, was the nation went into what you call economic turmoil, which is just a huge depression where many, many people are left in debt, and the government's out of money, and the government